Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Pradeep Goswami, Deputy Director at USI, and on behalf of General B.K. Sharma, Director USI, and Dr. Raghavan, Director General ICWA, I welcome you all to this UN webinar. We plan to conduct UN webinars in this year, and the inaugural one is on India and UN peace operations, principles of UN peacekeeping and mandate. 151 years old, autonomous body and the oldest think tank, whereas ICWA, a premier think tank of the country, and working along with MEA. Indeed, we are fortunate today to have a galaxy of UN professionals and practitioners, and they are participating today as a speaker in the various forums. All speakers in this webinar, including me, have a UN background, and they'll be introduced subsequently by our moderator, that is General Bordolai. A few words about General Bordolai. General Bordolai was commissioned into the Indian Army in June 1977, and he superannuated April 2014. He has held various assignments in the various interstate conflict zones within the country and outside, that is Sri Lanka and the United Nations operations. He has a rich experience of the United Nations with the earlier assignments, like he was a military observer at Angola, where myself and Bordolai, we were together. Then he had an assignment as a research forever on the UN peacekeeping with us in the USI, and he authored a book named UN Peacekeeping, Changing Security Scenario, Its Implications for the UN Peacekeeping. Subsequently, he was the Deputy Head of Mission and Deputy Force Commander in UNFIL at Lebanon from 2008 to 2010. Later, he was the Commandant of the Indian Military Training Team at Bhutan. Post-retirement, he remains very active and engaged with the peacekeeping organizations in India and abroad. And he has co-authored another book, Minds and Matters, and regularly contributes articles, papers on the UN peace operation. Recently, he has submitted his doctoral thesis on the UN peace operations to Tilburg University of Netherlands. And what I came to know yesterday only is that it is almost confirmed and the final process is on. To set the ball rolling for today's webinar, now I call upon General Bordolai to start the proceeding. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, General Goswami. Firstly, I thank both USI and ICWA for giving me this opportunity. And also my sincere compliment to ICWA and USI for taking this initiative to organize a series of events on this subject, peacekeeping. Now, to begin the day's proceeding, firstly, I request General B.K. Sharma, who is the Director of the USI, who is opening remarks. General B.K. Sharma is known to me for a long time, our lieutenant days. He's a distinguished career in our army. He has commanded a division. He served as a military observer in Central America and also as a defense attaché in Central Asia. His core area, of course, focus expertise is strategic net assessment. And on and off, he has been contributing. He has edited a number of articles. And presently, he's the director of USI of India. May I request General B.K. Sharma to give his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, General Bordolai. At the outset, I express my gratitude to Ambassador Raghavan, DG ICWA, for partnering with USI to conduct this series of events on UN reforms and restructuring with focus on UN peacekeeping operations. Also, I extend a warm welcome to our former director, General Satish Nambiar, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, who is our distinguished fellow, General Chandra Prakash, who has been the former Deputy Director of USI, General Singha, another distinguished fellow of USI, General Nehra, who is a very respected senior, and my colleagues at the USI, that is General Goswami and General Astama, to participate in this event. My deep gratitude to Mr. Cedric D. Conning of NUPI for sparing his valuable time and sharing his rich experience and deep insight with us. Of course, last but not the least, I must acknowledge the contribution of General Baudelaire for conceptualizing and moderating today's session. We intend to publish the takeaways from the webinar for wider circulation. Now, India's role and participation in the UN peacekeeping operation is well established and internationally acclaimed, and the USI has played a stellar role in the furtherance of India's UN peacekeeping operation endeavors. The Center for UN Peacekeeping was established at the USI under the visionary leadership of General Nambiar, and the USI nurtured this institution for 14 long years, transforming it to become a regional center for excellence in UN peacekeeping operations, and sort of rendering a yeoman service in the capacity building and practicing UN diplomacy. The CUNPK, as we call it, has grown to become a full-fledged unit of the Indian Army today. USI is also a member of the Challenges Forum, IPON. Our UN experts have interacted with HOTA panel, that is the high-level independent panel of peace operations. Our experts have participated in UN events in the framework of responsibility to protect under the aegis of Ministry of External Affairs. We have regularly hosted and participated in a number of UN peacekeeping international conferences and workshops. We conducted a series of courses for international participants in collaboration with UNITAR and organized lectures for which were delivered by high-ranking UN dignitaries, including Mr. Kofi Annan when he was the UN Secretary General and General Nambiar was our esteemed director. We've also organized international programs on protection of women in the conflict zones. The USI has published books and monographs on the peacekeeping, and we are endowed with a very rich resource faculty comprising Indian permanent representatives to the UN, heads of peacekeeping missions, those who have tenanted staff and advisory appointments in the UN headquarters at the policy making level. Besides, we have a vast reservoirs of military observers from the military, paramilitary and police forces as USI members. We know that since inception of peacekeeping operations in 1948, there have been about 71 peacekeeping operations. And in last 70 years, India has provided about 200,000 troops for a number of sensitive peacekeeping operations. Presently, there are about 16 missions with more than 85,000 uniformed personnel deployed across the world. And India is the second largest troop contributor with about 7,600 plus personnel deployed in 10 out of 16 active UN peacekeeping missions. Now, this is the contribution that our country is making. As we all know that peacekeeping is an onerous mandate, and the principles of peacekeeping are rooted in the lofty ideals of human dignity and comprehensive humanitarian security. Peacekeeping in its evolutionary journey has a mixed bag of hits and misses. It goes without saying that with the passage of time, the planning and conduct of peacekeeping has become more complex and daunting. Nature of conflicts have morphed from classic interstate to virulent intrastate conflicts with non-state actors, terrorists, and state proxies playing a major role. Besides, there are other complex transborder non-traditional security threats such as pandemics, calamities, organized crime, cybersecurity, and the like. We are in the era of highly complex gray zone conflicts. Our Prime Minister, during his speech at the 75th UN General Assembly session, which was themed, "The Future We Want, the UN We Need," had alluded to a commonly held belief that the UN is presently facing a crisis of command. And he had made a strong pitch for UN reforms and restructuring with a view to develop a deeper sense of multilateralism for conflict resolution and mitigation of non-traditional security threats. It is in the light of aforesaid, the USI and ICWA plan to hold these series of webinars for the cross-fertilization of ideas and for generating policy recommendations on the UN reforms and restructuring, particularly in the domain of peacekeeping. This initiative assumes added importance at a juncture when India is a member of the UN Security Council. I am sanguine that today's event will prove to be a critical curtain raiser for further dialogue on this hugely important subject of international importance. Without further ado, I hand over the proceedings to General Baudroy.
Thank you, General Sharma. Now, for the keynote address, we have none other than General Nambiar. Now, to introduce General Nambiar, there are three problems. One is very difficult. Second is very easy. Third is, of course, is very challenging. Difficult is that you do not know where to begin, where to end. So you have to just type his name, Google search, you will come to know what he is. Easy is that, of course, everybody knows about General Nambiar. So I will not take too much of time except for highlighting certain issues, aspects about General Nambiar's past profile, I would say. So to begin with, to set the record straight, let me tell you, when he became an officer, I was just 1 year old. Now you can understand the gap of the experience, professional expertise, which is very difficult to match. And a challenge is that to be able to ask to moderate a session where General Nambiar is present and giving a keynote address. And of course, he has a checkered career. He has held various important assignments. He commanded a division, he was a DGMO, and of course, he was in Iraq training team. He was in London as a defense advisor. And then, of course, he joined USI. And as far as his contribution to UN peacekeeping is concerned, I think he left an undeniable mark in this area. And what he has done, he was, I think, longest serving director of USI. And those days, I remember USI always in the forefront. When you talk of peacekeeping from outside, people is to see USI of India. In fact, he was part of the high-level panel. And personal level, I know today, if India can boast of that UN PK, I know no one other than me, I know as of now that what he has contributed. For his support, without his support, and I think this institution wouldn't have come up. Some regions, CVNPK got detached. That is a different issue, but his contribution is immense. At the personal level, of course, I decided to join USI after my tenure in Delhi. When I asked him, sir, I want to join USI, what do you think? He says, yes, I want someone like you. Therefore, my study of peacekeeping, I continue to remain as a student. And biggest challenge for me now is that like I said, the three problem challenge, that whether I hope I have not let him down. So without taking any more time, I request General Nambiar to give his keynote address.
Right. Thank you very much, Bertie, for those very kind remarks. First of all, let me say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be here with all of you. And I'd like to thank both Ambassador Raghavan and General Sharma for inviting me to deliver this keynote address at what promises to be an interesting webinar. Now, let me start by saying that during much of the 75-year history of the United Nations as an organization, of all its activities, I think peacekeeping operations have invariably attracted maximum attention, primarily because conflicts make dramatic news, and the deployment of an international force, military force, by the Security Council to preserve a fragile peace makes a good story that can capture public interest in this electronic age. Now, as one of the founding members of the United Nations, India's contribution to the maintenance of international peace and security has been second to none. And in no other field of activity has this been manifested more than in United Nations peace operations, commencing with our participation in the operations in Korea in 1950. Now, over the years, we have provided commanders, military observers, staff officers, contingents, and in later years, civilian police, including women police.
Around you and income tax people who live in our building. Nobody has any.
Sorry, what is that interruption about? Never mind. As I said, we have contributed various personnel to many of the United Nations missions deployed to keep the peace in various parts of the world. Now, the use of military contingents, as it were, many of you will remember, was first authorized by the United Nations in the Gaza Strip and the Sinai after the Arab-Israeli War in 1956. And I think it's a matter that of interest to know that from 15th November 1956 to 19th May 1967, when the next Arab-Israeli War broke out, 11 infantry battalion groups from India successively served in that mission. A force of over, I think, 13,000 all ranks over that period. And I mention this because the initial success of that force led the Security Council to readily accept a request by the Congo in 1960 for intervention on their attaining independence from Belgium, and for which mission again India provided 2 successive brigade groups during the period 1960 to 64. I shall touch upon this again a little later. Since then, of course, we have provided contingents in all parts of the world, and it would be far too numerous to mention, and I think not necessary, really. But I would like to highlight one point, that is that India has, I think, participated in every peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping operation in Africa, except the most recent one, I think, of the current operation in Mali. Every other operation India has participated in Africa. Now, in preparing ourselves for continued participation in the United Nations peacekeeping operations into the 21st century, I think we must take into account the radical changes that have taken place in the nature of the peacekeeping commitment. As you are all aware, UN peacekeepers are increasingly being sent to regions where civil war type situations prevail, where there are no agreements, or if there are, these are rather tenuous or broken without compunction, where the consent of the parties to the conflict is either not existent or cannot be relied upon. No constitutional authority exists in many places, or where it does, there is limited control. And in such situations, obviously, today's peacekeepers are not only required to keep the warring parties apart to the extent they can, but they get involved increasingly to undertake peace-building operations, safeguard humanitarian relief operations, monitor human rights violations, assist in mine clearance, monitor state boundaries or borders, provide civilian police support, assist in rebuilding logistics infrastructure like roads, railways, and bridges, and to support electoral processes and so on. Now, in addition to all this, one of the most important elements today is that protection of innocent civilians has become a mandated task for almost all UN peacekeeping missions. It was always part of our charter, I think, in UN missions. But today it is a mandated task for UN peacekeeping missions in most places, I would think. A task with many ramifications that need to be understood by the political and military leadership, both who send people there and who mandate them. There is a great deal, of course, that we can state on this subject, but for the purpose of today's discussion, I think I may make 2 or 3 points. Now, the use of force for the protection and implementation of the mission was first resorted to in the Congo mission in 1960-61, which I mentioned earlier. India had 2 successive brigade groups in that mission, and one of these was used to launch combat operations against mercenaries and Katangese rebels led by Mose Shombe. In that process, I must inform all of you, those who don't know, that the Indian contingent suffered a number of fatal casualties, 36 actually, and of course a large number injured, 124. And I say this with some feeling because one of my contemporaries from the days in the Indian Military Academy, Captain Gurbachan Singh Salaria, was killed in that operation. And he was awarded our highest military honor, the Paramveer Chakra. So this is not something which is new as a concept or a phenomenon. It was resorted to way back in 1960, the use of force. But what needs to be understood is that it has to be carefully calibrated and located within a credible political framework for the mission, in which the mission, both locally and internationally. And this, I think, invariably poses problems because of inadequate political support to missions that are set up. And I say this again with great feeling because of my personal experience. Regional players, as also the major powers, pursue their own agenda that in many cases do not necessarily complement the mission mandate. Now, the use of force also demands that appropriate resources be made available to the mission. And sad to say, in almost all UN missions deployed today, this is wanting because those who have the resources, both in terms of trained manpower and equipment, namely the developed world, are not participating any longer in UN peace operations. If UN peacekeeping is to remain effective, I must say the developed world must return to this commitment. And this should go beyond the present arrangement of seeking positions in senior management and command to provision of boots on the ground, as it were. Now, the connotations of the use of force, this final point I'd like to make on this aspect, must be understood by the Security Council members who mandate it and the staff at UN headquarters, and also equally importantly by the troop contributors. And the concept must be imaginatively involved. Because you see, peacekeepers must be mentally and physically attuned to the fact that the use of force will mean could mean inflicting casualties on belligerents. And obviously, that would mean casualties may well be incurred by the members of the force. So this has to be understood by those who mandate the missions and by countries like ours that are troop contributors. I would, of course, I don't want to say too much about the Center for UN Peacekeeping because General Sharma has already made that point. I am, of course, proud of the fact that I had a hand in setting up this center when I was the director of the United Service Institution of India. And it gives me great satisfaction to see that the center has grown into a center of excellence, not only regionally, but globally, because it is now called upon by the United Nations to run many events in order to, where they have international participation. But a point I would like to make, which is not universally, I think, understood or probably known, is that on every international course that this center runs, and we've been running this for many years now. I think twice a year we probably run it now. We have 15 vacancies offered to participants from the developing world. And this I say with some feeling is because these 15 participants, they travel from home country and back. Their stay, their training, their food, everything is paid for by the government of India, Ministry of External Affairs. I don't think there are too many countries in the world that provide this sort of. All that these chaps who come to attend the course have to spend on is in their local shopping. The rest is all covered by the government of India, Ministry. That I think is a great contribution that we make today in terms of training of UN peacekeepers. And of course, we have attendance from some of the developed world, the Americans, the British, the Australians, Japanese, Norwegians, Singaporeans. A number of them come on a self-financing arrangement. Now, the last point I wish to make is actually to suggest to you in the course of your deliberations to kindly apply yourself to 2 or 3 aspects which trouble me somewhat when I hear that it has become part of the discourse on UN peacekeeping. You see, peace building is one task which has now almost been thrust upon the UN peacekeepers. The moment you have that thrust on them, the peacekeeping missions will carry on into eternity. And that is why today we have missions in the field which was set up in 1948 and 49. I was happy to hear our permanent representative of the United Nations speak on this subject the other day and make the point that these age-old missions must be wound up. An exit policy must be framed. And you cannot have that if you load peacekeepers with peace-building operations. They are not, the military men are not geared, they can assist, but they are not the ones who need to undertake it. That's what my personal views you may wish to deliver. The other 2 aspects which are, I think, brief. One was briefly mentioned by General B.K. Sharma, the responsibility to protect concept being thrust on UN peacekeepers. I am very, very concerned about that. Because as you are probably aware, the responsibility to protect concept was evolved after the report of the high-level panel that I was a part of. But it is not, in my view, a task that should be thrust on peacekeepers. And the last point is about, I hear occasional remarks being made about terrorism being dealt with by UN peacekeepers. I'm afraid there again I have severe reservations. So these are the 3 issues I just leave with you for deliberation during the course of this webinar if you have the time and the inclination to do so. So thank you very much once again and wish you all the best in your deliberations.
Thank you, General Nabia, sir. Before we start the day's proceedings, 2 or 3 points I will just reiterate. Firstly, speakers are requested to adhere to the time of 15 to 20 minutes. Lesser will be better. And everyone else other than who is speaking requested to at least mute the mic and also the video. It doesn't make any difference. But then questions, if any, should be posted in the chat box. I recommend that no comments to be given and long comments. Question is better. And with this, I want to begin the proceedings of the day. That is, the subject is of principles of peacekeeping and mandate. Now, adherence to the 3 principles of peacekeeping, as a holy trinity it's called, is considered the first factor of successful peace operations. But the experience of the past decades suggests that adhering to these principles is becoming gradually more challenging and difficult than at the time when it was conceived. Even publications on principle of peacekeeping and the guidelines of 2008, I think it has oversimplified the 3 principles in just simply 2 pages. Now, these 3 principles was intricately connected, have different meanings at different levels, and the interpretations vary from conflict to conflict. The opinions of the policymakers at New York and those of the practitioners and also outside view of the academicians are at variance. As a result, there is a huge gap between the conceptual thinking of the principles and how it is applied in field, and it directly affects the mandated implementation. Now, discuss this subject today, we have got someone who has got the insight to the conceptual thinking of the subject from the New York. We have got an academician, we have got outside view, and there's that extensive research on a few complex peace operations, and of course, 3 practitioners. Now, all these 3 all of them are 5 speakers, their opinions may vary. But I believe that at the end of the discussions, our takeaways will help us to give us better clarity on the subject. Therefore, to begin the proceedings, we have none other than Ambassador Mukherjee to give us an insight into the perception of the peacekeeping principles at a strategic level, and of course, challenges in the mandate formulation. As you all know, Ambassador Mukherjee retired after 37 years of service as the permanent representative of India and New York, that is. He had earlier served in a number of countries, and his contribution is, he has one of the main contributions while he was there, apart from leading a lot of negotiation on behalf of India, that he created a virtual wall that is for the memory of the Indian peacekeepers. He also negotiated for the gap of 10 years for better emoluments to the Indian peacekeepers. He has got a Doctor of Civil Laws, and he has been contributing very oftenly to USI and many other think tanks. I would sum up this saying that Ambassador Mukherjee is a friend of peacekeepers. Therefore, I request Ambassador Mukherjee to deliver your talk on what you think or what others think at New York before you take into the field. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope all of you can hear me. I would like to thank General B.K. Sharma and my colleague Ambassador Raghavan for inviting me to speak at this seminar. And I would like to thank General Nambiar for having set the stage for the discussions that we will have today. I have been asked to speak on principles of UN peacekeeping, and I must begin by saying that the Charter of the United Nations does not provide any principles for UN peacekeeping. In fact, in 1948, when the ceasefire was arranged between Egypt and Israel after their first war, the Security Council mandated the deployment of unarmed troops from UN member states that volunteered to send such troops. The first UN peacekeeping mission, called the UNSTO, was comprised of 148 military observers contributed by West European countries, Australia and New Zealand, to monitor the ceasefire so that political efforts could resolve the crisis. The second peacekeeping operation is, of course, familiar to us in India. This is the UN Military Observer Group for India and Pakistan, or UNMOGIP, which was deployed in January 1949 and became a mandated operation after the India-Pakistan Karachi Agreement of July 1949. Following the 1971 India-Pakistan War and the July 1972 Agreement Treaty, formalizing the terms for concluding the war, there is no longer any role for the UNMOGIP, as it does not feature in the Simla Agreement. However, the UNMOGIP continues to be funded by the UN's regular budget. And I was very interested also to notice our colleague in New York called for a review to bring to an end such old ongoing peacekeeping operations. India's major participation in peacekeeping operations is traced to the Korean War of 1950 and to the big operations in the Middle East, which General Nambiar referred to, of the UNEF, as well as the deployment in the Congo, which he mentioned today. These early experiences of as UN peacekeepers provided the raw data for developing the principles of UN peacekeeping today. I must acknowledge the contributions of Major General I.J. Rickey, who was appointed as the first military advisor to the UN Secretary General between 1960 and 67, as being seminal in this context. General Bardaloy has referred to the three core principles of effective UN peacekeeping. These are deployment with the consent of the parties, impartiality in operations, and non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. Subsequent contributions to UN peacekeeping doctrine by Indian military officers have built on this, both at UN headquarters, where 2 Indian generals have served as military advisors in recent years, and in the field, where almost a score of Indian generals have acted as force commanders with distinction, including several who are in our seminar here today. 3 broad areas have evolved in UN peacekeeping, where the application of these fundamental UN peacekeeping principles is being tested. The first is the use of UN peacekeeping to ensure a political transition to peace. The peacekeeping operations in which this has been tested include UNPROFOR in the former Yugoslavia, which was commanded by General Satish Nambiar, UNTAC in Cambodia, UNOSOM in Somalia, UNAVEM in Angola, and more recently UNMIT in East Timor, and of course UNMISS in South Sudan, which has today become a tragic victim of the ineffectiveness of the UN Security Council to take the opportunity for a support for peace and socio-economic development. The second area where principles are being tested is peace building, and this has been referred to by General Nambiar earlier today. India became the first country to actually use women UN peacekeepers in peace-building efforts in Liberia from 2007 onwards. And I think it is useful to recall today that when UNMIL in Liberia was wound up in February 2018, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia commented, and I quote, "The contribution you have made in inspiring Liberian women, imparting in them the spirit of professionalism, and encouraging them to join operations that protect the nation, for that we will always be grateful," unquote. The third area is leading ground-level responses to the new challenges which have been mentioned by earlier speakers today. India's experience has shown that a professional approach to implementing the principles of peacekeeping to uphold impartiality in peacekeeping can pay dividends. Of course, the end of the Cold War resulted in a mushrooming of crisis. More than 20 new operations were deployed between 1989 and 1994 alone. The challenges posed by the ground situation altered dramatically the concept of UN peacekeeping principles. And as has been mentioned earlier today, the protection of civilians caught in the violence is today the main mandate of 11 out of the 13 active peacekeeping operations on the ground. The protection of civilians who are caught in conflicts within a member state of the United Nations is one issue where UN peacekeepers are called upon to make a positive difference. We will hear later in the discussion today the experience of how peacekeepers have handled this challenge in MONUSCO, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in UNMISS in South Sudan. But I think it is useful to conclude that a robust and interventionist response of UN peacekeeping to protect civilians may not be a sustainable answer and actually may compromise the principles of UN peacekeeping. If nothing else, the tragic killing of the Italian ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Congo in the last few days while traveling in a MONUSCO convoy illustrates that there are limitations on the ground to the ability of robust peacekeeping to bring about sustainable peace and security. Turning to South Sudan, the situation on the ground today in which the government of the host country, South Sudan, openly characterizes UN peacekeeping as working against its interests is again a serious challenge to the principle of UN peacekeeping. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
Okay, yeah, I lost my breath. So 3 issues are of critical importance for the success of future peacekeeping operations. The first is a requirement for the Security Council to take direct inputs from peacekeeping units deployed on the ground regarding the triggers to the dispute which is on the Security Council's agenda, while respecting the sovereignty of concerned member states. The second is a proactive role to be played by the Security Council for reaching an inclusive negotiated peaceful solution which involves all legitimate parties. And third, as has been mentioned by General Nambiar, the right people and resources must be deployed by the Security Council on the ground if the UN is to sustain an eventual peace solution. The unsustainability of using armed force, which I referred to earlier, means that the Security Council will need to include elected members of the Council who are troop contributing countries to formulate a solution to the conflict which gives the primacy to political mechanisms. And this was the conclusion of the Horta panel, which was referred to by General Sharma, the high-level panel on peacekeeping operations, in a whole section called the primacy of politics. I think that peacekeeping today cannot be continued to be used as a lever without keeping this objective of the primacy of politics in focus. The second is that although General Nambiar said that he had some concerns about terrorist threats and peacekeeping, I think in a limited way, the UN Security Council and people who are well-wishers of UN peacekeeping must actually bring to the forefront the fact that today UN peacekeeping missions have become the target of terrorist groups. It started with UNDOF in 2013, and General Singha is with us in our panel and will no doubt speak of it. But as I speak, it is in Mali, in MINUSMA, that terrorist threats to UN peacekeeping have become very stark. The inability or the disinclination of the UN Security Council to address the terrorist threat to UN peacekeeping has to be reviewed, because the vast majority of UN peacekeepers who have died in the last few years, as many as 231, have died in Mali as a victim of terrorist attacks. So we cannot have an ostrich in the sand approach to the threat posed by terrorism to UN peacekeepers. And I'd like to conclude by offering 2 suggestions on how peacekeeping principles can be reinvigorated. The first one is a limited option, but it is available. And that is something that we have spoken of before we became an elected member of the Security Council, which is to invoke Article 44 of the UN Charter to get direct inputs regarding the deployment of troops from those countries which are contributing troops, and to make UN peacekeeping more effective. For example, a lot of discussions take place within the UN structures as well as in academia on why the UN does not touch upon local dispute settlement mechanisms which exist on the ground in Africa, for example, or even in Asia, to give a way out to make peacekeeping more effective. In India, after I've come back, I have heard this from diplomats from South Sudan who say that we have tribal dispute settlement mechanisms, but no one asks us or no one turns to these mechanisms. Instead, they outsource the solutions that are faced to the challenges faced by the Security Council to regional groupings like IGAD, which at the end of the day has not been able to come up and resolve the matter. The second is, of course, a subject on which all of us know a lot, and that is the need for structural reform of the Security Council itself. Because we must remember that in 2005, when world leaders gave a mandate to reform the Security Council, they said that the reason for reforming it, and I quote, was to make it more broadly representative, efficient, and transparent, and thus to further enhance its effectiveness and the legitimacy and implementation of its decisions, unquote. So if the peacekeeping mandates, which are rolled over year after year, especially in many of the missions in Africa and Asia, cannot be implemented, if they have no exit strategy, then I think the solution to this problem and this challenge facing the principles of UN peacekeeping must lie in the early reform of the Security Council. With these words, I thank you for listening to me, and I turn the floor back to General Bardaloy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukherjee. Thank you very much for the inside view, what people think in the Security Council. And more importantly, I think that the points and fine recommendation we have given, that I'm convinced that when I said that you are a friend of the peacekeepers, because your views and recommendations are pretty much aligned with normally the work practitioners feel. And I only hope what you are suggesting, and that the people who should listen in our government, they will take up the case and continue to lobby the case so that some really reform. Because like what you say, that you made a mention about this South Sudan, they prefer to solve issues themselves. I think it is in our DNA. We feel that our kind of system is the best. Or I would say India will say the India system of democracy is the best. America will say that we want to go outside and impose our way of functioning, our lifestyle. It happens in the day-to-day life, also. The neighbors want to say, our parents want to impose our. So we do not actually, we are not very constructive. I think we need an inclusive process. I'm sure the points what you have brought out, including protection of the civilian, etc., the challenges are there. It will come out in when we discuss about the complex missions. So now, after listening to Ambassador Mukherjee, now you move to the field. First, in this area, we deal with two missions basically, one South Sudan and Congo. The first mission, I wish to address the South Sudan, and we have with us Dr. Cedric. Thanks again, Dr. Cedric, for accepting invitation of the USI and ICW to enlighten us on the subject. Dr. Cedric is associated with a senior advisor to African Center of Constructive Resolution Disputes, and also he coordinates this NUPI Center, UN and Global Governance. He also deals with this effectiveness of peace operation network. Let me tell you, a lot of people, academicians have an institution, a lot of research in this field, but not that just to flatter him because he's here. That when I looked at the size and the work of the other organization, that IPON is something that there's some work they have done, feel extensive research on the subject, mostly complex mission. It's an eye-opener. And I have been actually following IPON in my work. I constantly refer or cite upon. So, Dr. Cedric, I hope you will enlighten us how people think about what is actually academicians' outside view of the South Sudan. Most importantly, to take a leaf from what Ambassador Mukherjee said, that when it comes to the core objective of the peacekeeping operation, that is that protection of the civilians. You know, how does it happen when you use force? And second is that where is it that consent and impartiality stand today? The floor is yours, Dr. Cedric.
Thank you very much, General Badalai, and let me just start by thanking General Swarma and Dr. Rakhavan of USI and ICWA for inviting me to join you today. It's an honor to participate in this seminar with so many distinguished experts and practitioners and researchers on this topic. And it is, of course, also a pleasure to engage and be part of this Indian discussion with the absolute, distinguished record that India has in United Nations peacekeeping operations. So I've been asked to talk about the relevance of the principles of use of force in the case of UNMISS, the United Nations mission in South Sudan. And I'll start with, for those of you that are not familiar with a few quick, just to put us in the context of the historic context that we were looking at. Of course, South Sudan became independent from Sudan in 2011. And this also as a result of a form of a UN mission and a process that the UN supported leading up to that. But then, unfortunately, soon after interdependence, in December 2013, a civil war started in South Sudan between the government and a splinter group of the government or the governing party, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition. And this civil war raged between 2013 and 2018, and estimates vary, but could be almost 500,000 people that potentially have been killed during that period. So it's been a very, very significant civil war. During all that time, the United Nations mission in South Sudan was deployed in the country, and we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about their role. But just to say that there was, various attempts over that period to broker peace. There was one peace agreement in 2016, but it broke down in July 2016, and there was another round of conflict, and we'll refer to some incidents out of that period in a moment when we talk about protection of civilians. But then in September 2018, a revitalized peace agreement has been agreed to. And since that time, the peace have more or less been holding. There's still some conflict continuing in parts, especially in Equatoria, with some of the non-signatory parties to the revitalized peace agreement. And of course, outside of the civil war, South Sudan before independence and since independence, they've also had a major problem with intercommunal conflict, for instance, between farmers and herders, related and conflict between different herder communities related to, for instance, cattle raiding and so on. And at times this intercommunal conflict generate more casualties than the civil war. So, and that is continuing, and that's seasonal, and that's a major challenge as well, that the UN mission, both UN UNMISS with one S and two S's, have been dealing with throughout the whole period of that the UN has been there. But this civil war has displaced about 3.5 million people. It's the third largest displacement of people in modern time after Syria and Afghanistan. There's about 2.3 million refugees in neighboring countries and about 1.8 million IDPs in South Sudan as a result of this civil war. So it's in this context that the UN mission then operated. And when the conflict broke out in 2013, tens of thousands of civilians fled to UN compounds across the country. and the UN had to overnight adapt to the situation where it became the host and the protector of these civilian internally displaced persons. And it ended up throughout most of this period until today, protecting almost 200,000 IDPs across the country in what was called protection of civilian sites, which was areas that were developed adjacent to and bordering UN compounds with the protection of the UN. This task that kind of emerged, it wasn't planned, but it was an adaptation to the reality of the situation. This became kind of the main task of UNMISS during this period, to protect and care for these IDPs. Took most of the resources of the mission. There was also some limited patrols in the immediate vicinity of UN bases and in the major towns where the UN was deployed. The UN also, of course, provided protection for humanitarian convoys and humanitarian actors, and it has provided support, especially logistical support, to the various ceasefire mechanisms and bodies that have been set up to help to implement the peace agreement in 2016 and then again since 2018. But if we then look at the context of the use of force, and specifically in the context of protection of civilians, maybe two things I would like to highlight. Let's perhaps just first remind ourselves that when we talk about protection of civilians, this is in UN context a three-tiered policy and approach, with the first tier focused on prevention, and this refers to how you plan, how you engage with the communities and the stakeholders, how you negotiate passage. And for instance, in South Sudan, there's also been an effort to negotiate weapon-free zones around particular towns and cities, for instance. So those are the preventative steps. The second tier is physical protection. So that is where you would use force, or at least force projection, to deter and protect by using physical presence. And the third tier is the enabling environment. So this may involve things like training local police forces and creating a legal and a political and a structural and a governance environment within which protection can take place. So, and of course, in this context, the military component of UN peacekeeping has a particular role in the physical protection tier, one of the tiers, but there's also political, civil affairs, human rights, and other civilian officers and units within peacekeeping operations that play a very important role in the first and the third tier. And of course, you have in South Sudan context also police, and especially formed police units, that play a very important role in protection within these protection of civilian camps, for instance. So the protection has mostly taken place, as I mentioned, inside the protection of civilian sites, but also in the context of patrols around the areas where the UN are present in the towns and settlements, for armed escorts, and then of course also for protection of the UN and international actors that the UN is responsible for in this area. So in this context, I would like to highlight two dilemmas, especially that I think the South Sudanese, this experience of UNMISS has really highlighted. The first is that I think although the protection of civilian policy and protection of civilians mandates that are given to UN peacekeeping operations imply that the United Nations peacekeepers should protect civilians in imminent threat of danger against any potential threat, even if that threat were to come from the host nation. I would say that our experience in South Sudan and elsewhere, but let's focus on South Sudan, has really questioned whether it is feasible to use force against the host nation to protect civilians or for other purposes. The host nation is of course providing consent, but also legally providing consent through the Status of Forces Agreement, and can withdraw that consent. So I would say two aspects that I would like to highlight in the South Sudanese case. I mean, in the South Sudanese case, first of all, the government forces in South Sudan is a formidable force. This is not, as in many other countries and many other places where UN peacekeepers are deployed, where the national forces do not have significant firepower. This is a country where the government of South Sudan or the South Sudan army have attack helicopters, have tanks, have artillery, and are really capable, more capacity than the UN has in both cases. So if it were to come to a serious confrontation, and we have seen this, for instance, in July 2016, when the conflict broke out in Juba, especially, where the main UN compound is, you had South Sudanese government attack helicopters hovering over and firing into the UN compound. Mortar attacks, unclear whether this was by mistake or by design. But for instance, we had 2 Chinese peacekeepers die in July 2016 inside a UN compound as a result of mortar attack or a mortar blast. And the other dimension of that that I'll come back to in more detail in a moment, but it's also the fact of the degree of freedom of movement, and therefore on the consent side that the government has over the United Nations. But first on the use of force side. So the one element then, as I mentioned, is the extent to which, in some cases, in the case of South Sudan, for example, the government of South Sudan has military capability that is perhaps more significant than the United Nations, and therefore questions the degree to which the United Nations can use force. The other dilemma, as I mentioned, is the possibility that the host nation can withdraw consent as a result of the United Nations using force directly against that country and or against that government. And in the case of South Sudan, I would say it creates a real dilemma, because basically the question is whether you, in an individual incident, interfere, and that incident can spiral out of control in the sense that it can, become a much more serious confrontation. And that confrontation can either, tactically become a threat against not only the peacekeepers, but also the people that the peacekeepers are protecting, keeping in mind these tens of thousands of civilians that the UN are protecting inside their bases. And if such a confrontation were to bring a firefight into a UN compound, the effect that would have. So that's the kind of immediate tactical consideration, but also the strategic consideration that such a confrontation could result in withdrawal of consent, and therefore in denying the United Nations the ability to protect these tens of thousands of civilians that the United Nations are protecting, should consent be withdrawn and the mission have to be withdrawn from that situation. So these are the considerations that come into play when we consider whether it's possible to really use force against the host nation in the protection of civilians context. I'll also just mention, General Bartolai mentioned the studies that we've undertaken as the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network. And we have undertaken a study of South Sudan as well, the UN mission there. And one of the key findings is that the mission has significantly contributed to protecting civilians, especially those civilians in the protection of civilian camps, but of course have not been able to bring the war to an end, nor was that its mandate. It did provide support to IGAD, who has been responsible for implementing the peace agreement. Maybe just last 2 things that I would like to mention is that I think our experience in South Sudan also highlight 2 other issues. The one is that among the troop contributing countries, to the UN mission in South Sudan, there's quite a difference of interpretation of the mandate and of the principles of use of force. Some countries there insist that it's a Chapter 6 mission. other countries accept that it's a mission that has Chapter 7 mandate when it comes to the protection of civilians. And there's quite a range of difference between how different countries use force, project force, and so forth. So, well, let me come back when we come to the recommendations, how to deal with that. And the second issue is the issue of caveats. We still, from time to time, find that when the force commander tasks a specific troop contributing country to undertake certain tasks, that caveats are put forward that prevent those countries from carrying out those tasks, and then other countries like India have to fill the gap. So I think this is a serious challenge when it comes to force generation for the United Nations that we have to face. Let me summarize and conclude by making 3 recommendations from our experience and lessons from South Sudan. The first relates to how we approach protection of civilians. As I mentioned, I think we need to clarify to ourselves whether we think the use of force against the host nation is really a realistic task to give to UN peacekeeping operations, and to really unpack the implications of that task if we do continue to hold this as a policy in protection of civilians. The second is that I think we need to give even stronger emphasis to the preventative and political role, the primacy of politics when it comes to protection as well, and focus on the enabling environment. Of course, we can use presence and projection of force as means through physical protection also to contribute to protection, but the actual use of force should always be really a last resort. In a sense, when we have to use force to protect civilians, it shows that the first and third tier efforts have failed. Secondly, I think it's important to focus more on unity of purpose, taking various steps in the mission, in outreach to the capitals, in New York, where the various military advisors and attachés are present, to make sure there's a common understanding among the troop contributing countries about how the principles of peacekeeping, and especially the use of force, will be approached in a particular mission. So if we don't have that as a major dilemma that the force command and others on the ground have to deal with. And lastly, the issue of managing consent. One of the challenges in our mission in South Sudan, also in the mission in Sudan, has been how the host nation have used a range of techniques to deny consent at the tactical level, to delay things. The mission has to seek approval from the government when it wants to use, for instance, flights. I mentioned earlier, just by as a last example, the 2 Chinese peacekeepers that passed away in July 2016 as a result of the mortar attack. In that particular case, for example, the UN was unable to get permission to move those 2 wounded peacekeepers to another compound by air, because at that time it was denied by the government of South Sudan, and during the whole conflict that was taking place at that time. So managing consent, I think, is also an extremely important element that we are learning out of our experience in the United Nations mission in South Sudan. Let me stop there, General Barlai. Thank you very much to you and colleagues for the opportunity to share this lessons learned from South Sudan. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Cedric. Thank you so much for giving us the inside view of the implications and the shades of colors of principles of peacekeeping. How does it affect the mandate implementation, given the unique dynamics of the conflict in South Sudan, given that from the day they have become independent, they have been fighting among themselves. You have actually echoed the voice of Ambassador Mukherjee. When he said that we got to see that, look at it, that when you use force to protection of civilians, because it has got implications not only on the consent part, they're already doing it, they were saying that they're using techniques to deny. And what will be the implication to use force when the host nation itself become the perpetrators of violence? Obviously, you do not know whether somebody reacts, the impartiality, consent, and of course use of force, all they get so interconnected. And as you think, that's why beginning I said that the even publication is oversimplified, that the 3 principles in 1.5 days. And if you look at the more and more complex peacekeeping operation and also the traditional peacekeeping, we will find the different shades and colors. So I will not take too much of time of yours. Thanking you again. I hope you'll be here for some time, at least for half an hour or so that you can listen what others have to say. Then we'll go to next difficult mission, that is Congo. By far, Congo is one of the most complex and difficult missions. I think number of external powers and the groups they are fighting inside Congo, I think it cannot be compared with anyone else. It's very difficult. There are times people have been calling that what is this mission is doing at a time for close it down. Well, it is easier said than done. To tell us about how does the Congo and the MONUSC, from MONUSC to MONUSC now, what is the implication? How do you look at these interpretation of the peacekeeping principles? How does it affect? We have got with us today General Chandra Prakash, who has held various important assignments while in service. Then he was a defense advisor in France, and he also he was in Iran and Iraq, he was the military observers. And while in service, he was also the board of management of Center for United Nations Peacekeeping, what we talk about. He was also the deputy direct editor of the USI before he moved away from there. And before he retired as a commandant of the Defense Service Staff College in Wellington, India, he was the force commander in MONUSC in the most difficult time. And during his time, a lot of incidents has taken place where the people came towards Goma. And I think one of the mechanisms which have been used by UN is a force intervention brigade had taken place there. But no one else is better suited than him to tell us exactly what does it mean, because he can feel for it. We are slightly outsider. So I request General Chandra Prakash to educate us, inform everyone about the principles of peacekeeping operation. How do you relate to these in the context of interstate conflict like Congo? Thank you, sir.
Sir, please unmute yourself, sir. Lieutenant.
Am I readable now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I said good morning to all attendees. Thank you, John Life, for the introduction. I, at the outset, would like to thank General B.K. Sharma, the Director USI, and also the Director General ICWA, Ambassador T.C. Raghavan, for giving me this opportunity to share my experience of Congo in this forum. I do see that present in this forum is also Ambassador Manjeet Puri. So are you there? If you are, please acknowledge, because I wish to pay my regards to you. He was the Deputy Permanent Representative of India in the Indian mission in New York during the difficult days for the force commander in MONUSCO, and he was a great support because he was able to put the things in the right perspective, both to the UN headquarters, UN Security Council, and as well as the capital in India, that's Delhi. Thank you, Ambassador Manjeet. Let me start by giving a little background of the DRC. The conflict in DRC is predominantly on the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This part of Congo, that is the eastern region of Congo, has been host to the most complex, longest, and brutal conflict in history. It's because of natural got a copper, diamonds, castrite, and it's all. Then it is a fall only in the mid-90s. Due to this, in 2010, about 7 armed groups. They are in dozens. The armed groups the
Here, I think there is something wrong somewhere.
Motivations. Can I continue? I said these armed groups claim diverse motivations and reasons for participating in the conflict. Some say they are protecting the interests of their ethnic groups, and the other extreme is that it's also an attempt to enlarge the Islamic State influence which exists in Uganda and have linkages with Al-Shabaab, that is the armed group ADF NALU. The activities of these armed groups have made the conflict very complex. One thing is true, that each of these armed groups resort to brutal targeting of civilians, illegal exploitation of natural resources, and use rape as weapon of war. Almost all and most cases to the local population purely out by violent activities, by coercion. Surely motivation is, but their lifeline is of the UN said that the abusive methods that these armed groups resort to the economic reasons, and they all resort to exploitation of extractive natural resources. Under such circumstances, protection, or rather the living of civilians, the day-to-day living of civilians is a problem. It is but that the international community, in order to protect them, had to sanction the authorization of use of force to support the primary task of the mandate, which is protection of civilians. This is the priority task for MONUSCO. I would rather say that use of force in MONUSCO has evolved over a period of time and yet not stabilized. It was previously being used at the tactical level. Now it is being used at the strategy level in terms of offensive tasks, offensive operations being undertaken by the Force Intervention Brigade. There has been a constant demand on the mission for robust peacekeeping. And in my personal view, I think there was nothing wrong in it, as long as it was primarily intended to be used for protection of civilians. But the question is, was it used or is it being used in an appropriate manner? Are the civilians being protected to the desired degree? That's a mute question, and I will, in my discussion today, highlight certain reasons why mission, in spite of being authorized a very robust mandate, hasn't delivered all the time, and what can be done to ensure better protection of civilians. And in this, I would like to say that when we are looking at protection of civilians, it's not only a military task. It is a holistic task of the mission. If you look at the numbers, about 5.4 million people have died in Congo due to the conflict and related reasons. But when we are talking of related reasons, more people have died because of hunger, bad health, disease, than actually they have died due to a bullet or because of the collateral damage caused by the between the peacekeepers and the armed groups. Now, just to put the things in the correct perspective, I would like to say that I was the force commander. I took over as the force commander in 2010 when things in in Congo were getting better. That is the time MONUC got converted to MONUSCO. There were a difference of views between the Congolese government and the UN headquarters with respect to extending the mandate of the mission. The Congolese authorities felt that all was well for the mission to draw down. Whereas the UN Security Council felt that time is yet not right, the civilians are not adequately protected, and there are areas where civilians are under serious threat. And as a matter of compromise between the host nation and the UN Security Council, MONUC was converted to MONUSCO as being added as part of the stabilization, to stand for stabilization, and with a primary emphasis, apart from protection of civilians, was on stabilization. That really means nation building, peace building, institution building, and security sector reforms. The government of DRC readily accepted to extend this mission because their intention was not to neutralize the armed groups, purely neutralize the armed groups, but they wanted the international community to be proactively involved in nation building. All kept going well. The mission did number of successful operations against the main armed group that time, FDLR, sometimes jointly with the National Army and sometimes on their own. But the results were very encouraging. There were ups and downs, but overall I would rather say that mission was doing a great job. But then came the elections in November 2011. These elections were not perceived to be did not carry the credibility and the legitimacy that it should have, and therefore it resulted in desertions from the National Army, that is the FARDC, and there was a group formed, which is a very potent group formed, which is M23, which everybody has heard of. This armed group was supported by the neighbors. They achieved great amount of success. They initially captured the town closest to the border of Congo, that is on the tri-junction of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda, called Bunagana. Peacekeepers had done a great job in the sense that we had encouraged FARDC to take up defenses there. We had helped them to with all that we could. We had helped them to launch counterattacks, but then there was no will on the part of the National Army to stand and fight M23. I would like to highlight here that not only did MONUSCO force train them to take up defenses, help them in taking up defenses, but also supported them with mortars, with attack helicopters. That means robustly supported them with all the resources, military resources, but there was no will to fight for by the National Army, and therefore many of the contingents got instructions from their capitals that enough is enough. There is no need for you to be robust anymore. They kept capturing one town after another, starting from July 2011. Finally, they did manage to enter Goma in November 2011, where I along with the Deputy Force Commander, were present at the forward-most base. What is interesting to note here, I'll take you down to the most lowest tactical level of the base, so that you can perceive the situation at first hand with respect to whether the force must be used or must not be used. I gave orders for the base to open up fire on the M23 which was going by. Moment the guns were targeted at them, M23 ran back. And should the force have been used, and the base would have fired at them, many of them would have been massacred, and the bullets would have been in their backside. I'm sure, again, the mission would have come under a lot of criticism. But then the matters didn't stop there. M23 did not enter the town from that area, but went into the town from many other directions where MONUSCO forces were not there. That is just a part of the game. What I'm trying to highlight here is that the situation was difficult. You could be criticized anyway for using force and for also not using force. Since in wherever MONUSCO was present, M23 was not causing any damage to property or was not threatening the civilians, there was no reason for us to use the force. I did consult people in various quarters in the UN headquarters. They left the decision to me, and I, along with the Deputy Force Commander, went around the town and we found everything was normal, and so therefore we let the things happen the way it did happen. And though, of course, we did get criticized for it. But what is not said in the media is the good things the mission did. Good thing was that because of the mission's proactive patrolling of the town, even when M23 was there and being present in all corners of the town, we were able to prevent the casualties and atrocities to the civilians. One lesson that clearly emerged is that the media will always buy the bad news and publish the bad news rather than tell good things the mission was doing. And to that extent, I would rather blame our own selves because our strategic communications at that time were lacking. Now that apart, now coming back to the use of force, no amount of discussion on relevance of use of force and the principles of peacekeeping is complete without making reference to the Force Intervention Brigade. Talking of Force Intervention Brigade, after M23 had entered Goma, or rather before they actually had entered Goma, right from July 2011 when they had captured Bunagana, discussions had already started with ICGLR, SADC and AU with respect to a reinforcing brigade being created so that the mission can stop further advance of M23. Or rather, not only the mission, but the region as such, because some of the neighbors felt that unless these activities of this group are checked, they could threaten the neighbors too. Some of the neighbors. When Goma was taken over by M23, ICGLR, SADC and AU decided that they will provide troops for the reinforcing brigade. However, they did not have the financial wherewithal to do that, as it would cost about $100 million US. That is the time UN, which was concerned with the protection of civilians, readily agreed to creation of this force, an intervention force. And but then they were always cautious of the fact that if they did not have some leverages with the regional authorities, there would be problems, and there could be, should I say, there would be long-term issues with the civilians and political dynamics unless they took a look at the mandate. So finally, because it suited all parties, that is the host government, the regional association and countries, and also the UN, Force Intervention Brigade was sanctioned in July 2013 with a very unprecedented mandate. That mandate was to undertake offensive operations jointly with the National Army or independently to neutralize the armed groups. And in that, the priority of armed groups was given. The priority one was M23, then was ADF, FDLR, ADF, and many more armed groups. Here, the shift in the level of use of force was very evident. That means the force now, the mission had to apply force not at the tactical level but at the strategic level, which at that point of time was a welcome initiative. Because M23 having taken over most of the eastern DRC, the government of DRC was at a great disadvantage. M23 would never have come to the negotiating table. Now coming to how good has this mandate of authorization of force intervention brigade has been. Yes, at that point of time it was good because it provided a political and military edge to the UN and the host government to bring M23 to the negotiating table, and it did weaken M23. In the initial stages, because there was will from the TCCs, the three TCCs who had provided the troops to FIB to take proactive action to launch offensive ops, the military operations were successful, notwithstanding the casualties that they suffered. But over a period of time, now that for about, let's say about little less than a decade that the Force Intervention Brigade has been there, it is time to do a good analysis whether such models should be applied in other missions, and can this system continue to be a part of the peacekeeping. My views on this are that yes, under difficult circumstances for the government, for the UN mission, as a benevolent critic, it was a good idea. The mission needed a reinforcement, needed a force which could tilt the balance in favor of the mission and the host government, and M23 had to be neutralized. But the facts of the case are also that apart from the military operations, there are many other reasons which defeated M23. One was that the international community had put a lot of support, a lot of pressure on the nations which are supporting M23, and that reduced the military capabilities of M23. Then there was infighting between various factions of M23, which led to the surrender of the leaders of M23, and therefore dissipation of M23 as a group. Now, where it has not delivered, that there is another potent armed group called the ADF, which is there in eastern DRC, particularly in this northern portion of North Kivu province, that is in the Beni area. ADF continues to target the civilians at will even today, in spite of the force intervention brigade elements have being there and being proactive involved. Now, what emerges is that from this force intervention brigade is that as long as the TCCs get to undertake of operations against the groups, the TCCs will deliver. And as and when this political support is withdrawn, or rather the national capitals do not give a green signal to their TCC use force, irrespective of whatever the UN may say or host government may demand. To take TCCs in board if you want robust peacekeeping to be successful. As far as the consent, the principle of consent, impartiality, and use of force in self-defense and support of the mandate is concerned, I think under exceptional circumstances in which Congo was placed at the time of M23, these principles have to be applied in a very flexible manner. The reason is that peacekeepers cannot be bystanders and turn their faces the other side when civilians are being massacred. Now, in interstate conflicts or intrastate conflicts where there's a counterinsurgency like situation, it is not feasible to get the consent of all the parties. As long as you have the consent of the host government, that should be good enough. And you should just not worry about the principle of consent because that's not feasible. The question is, when the host government gives you consent, does it give you only consent temporarily, or does it give you consent not only for undertaking military operations, but also gives you a political consent to have freedom to set many other things right, which are not going right for the country. As far as impartiality is concerned, yes, there is a need to be impartial, but then you cannot be neutral. The difference between the two is that when things are going wrong, you are neutral when you look the other side. You're impartial when you tell both the parties when the things are not going right. You say it with equal amount of conviction that you too are not doing things right, and then intervene accordingly. In the case of Congo, it is not only the armed groups which are a threat to the civilians, it is also the national army, their own security forces, the FARDC, which, because of being poorly trained and not being properly paid and not being looked after, is also a threat to the civilians. The experience of the past is that whenever you have raised any issues with respect to the FARDC, you have stopped support to the FARDC because they themselves are involved in human rights violations. the national government has not been taking it in a supporting manner and setting it right. Or if they do it only verbally but never implement it. And therefore, they're not happy with the mission when such issues are raised with them. On the use of force, the question is, will the use of force lead to long-term solution of the problem? The answer is clearly no. The reason is, even when you launch proactive offensive operations, you clear the area, that area has to be held by the national authorities and the government has to do proper administration there. If it doesn't do it in quick time, then the situation gets worse, the armed groups get burdened and then come back and then cause more problems for the civilians because they feel that the civilians supported the UN and the national authorities, and therefore the problem only gets aggravated. So when you look at the use of force, yes, for short term it's good, but in the long term there are other issues which are mostly political in nature that have to be addressed. Unfortunately, since these don't get addressed, so the use of force for short time without follow-up action becomes counterproductive. The last point that I wish to make is, it is not that all the TCCs do not wish to be robust under such circumstances. Any peacekeeper, particularly the peacekeeper who is in uniform, when he sees atrocities, when he finds that civilians are under threat, is willing to act. But the question is, does he have the wherewithal to do it? The answer is clearly no. For example, the kind of wherewithal given to Force Intervention Brigade has never been given to the TCCs of the framework brigades. There was no intelligence that was given to the TCCs. Much information is given, but there's no actionable intelligence. The framework brigade TCC have not fired their weapons for ages. Then the question is, where is there adequate means of mobility? The answer is no. Did they have the snipers? The answer is no. Whereas all these things, these resources have been provided to the Force Intervention Brigade. They have the snipers, they have the special forces, they have the recce company, they have the artillery battery, and they also had the latest attack helicopters of the South Africans. But more than that, they also had the, should I say, clear-cut signal from their national capitals that you will use force, and therefore they did what they did. The question is, as long as it's a collation of the willing to use force, the TCCs, particularly the military peacekeepers, will deliver, and the results will be achieved. The question is, will it bring lasting peace or not? And that's a mute question. And I would end up by saying, I think I've taken a considerable amount of time. I would end up by saying that if the peacekeeping missions have to be successful, the TCCs have to be taken on board. The missions have to be provided with the necessary wherewithal in terms of intelligence, in terms of the military capabilities, in terms of mobility. And if you are expecting them to do peace building as well, then you have to train the peacekeepers for undertaking peace building tasks, which unfortunately not many peacekeepers are trained to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chandraprakash sir. You said that you have taken time, but you made a lot of sense. That's why I did not want to interrupt you. And a lot of points, important issues you have highlighted, but I don't want to elaborate on that now because you are really running short of time. Because otherwise, I've done very, very self-explanatory points. I think we'll be at the end of the session. Now we move on to these two traditional peace operations. The first will be by General Singha, followed by General Nehra. Let me tell you, both General Singha and General Nehra were double-headed. The first person who were double-headed was General Nambiar. He was the first and the last head of the mission and the force commander. And then, of course, we have both these head of the mission in UNDOF and also in UNIFIL. They are double-headed. It has got its own advantages. As you go along, we'll be able to see. General Singha, of course, he had a various important assignment he held during his career. He has a tenure in Ethiopia, Eritrea, UNMI as a chief logistic officer. He has addressed some of the important issues, several occasions, security councils. He's a very highly educated man. Most importantly, that he has been the head of the mission and the force commander of UNDOF, and most difficult time when the ISI has got involved. And these two missions, UNDOF and UNIFIL, normally are not in limelight because you don't hear too much of casualties taking place. You don't hear unless somebody fires from the either side. But unlike these interested conflicts, but the implications or importance of these two missions, I would say, and one more mission, ANSO, they are in the crosshair. They're so unique that little bit of instability can create problem for everyone. So without taking much of time, I request General Singha to deliberate on what he feels about UNDOF, especially focusing the principles of peacekeeping and how it can relate. But I request him once again, please wrap it up before 15 minutes. Otherwise, we'll have to cut it down to question and answer sessions. And I have been buzzed constantly by the control that running against time. All yours, General Singha.
Thank you, Bodhi sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We now come to a smaller mission, the most traditional and sublime mission, which was where you just, ever since 1974, you just had to look, cook, and sleep and report what you had seen. But everything changed with the Arab Spring, which started, as you know, from Tunisia, spread eastwards, and came to Syria somewhere in March 2011. By end of the year, the opposition groups were formed, and the Free Syrian Army and a lot of independent armed opposition groups started challenging the authority of the Syrian government. And while the Syrian government started operating against them, these groups found that our buffer zone or area of separation of UNDOF, which was about 10 kilometers wide in the north, and then it funneled down to 1 kilometer in the south because there's a big wadi. In the north, of course, is Mount Hermon, and you have UNIFIL towards the north. So, this kind of a setting, as it is, Syria had never agreed to any deployment of air efforts or anti-aircraft guns with their experience of 1967 war. And this mission was a very, very traditional mission. Not a single round was fired between the two sides. But having seen that this is a very safe place, the armed opposition groups started coming into the area of separation, where no armed elements of either party, Israel or Syria, were supposed to be present. So, it so happened that when these groups entered with heavy weapons and all, the violations were reported by UNDOF, but we had to get adjusted to a new normal, where the Syrian army also started chasing these groups into the area of separation. And there was crossfire under which the UN troops came. There were incidents of carjacking. There were incidents of weapon snatching. And the UN peacekeepers being taken as prisoners. Now, in all that melee, when we talk about the principles of peacekeeping, for a chapter 6 mission, it was very, very, all three principles were being followed for 38 years. But suddenly, the relationship that Dr. Cedric has brought in between your mandate and the principles of peacekeeping, the conflict started coming up. The mandate of UNDOF was very simple, one-liner in fact. And it is so simple that it also is an asset that you could do anything in good faith. It says UNDOF to employ its best efforts to maintain the ceasefire and see to it that it is scrupulously observed. And that is it. Basically, it involves three things. In 1974, since 1974, maintain the ceasefire between Israel and Syria, has also supervised the disengagement of Israel and Syrian forces, which actually followed the instructions, and there was never ever a kind of challenge to that. And then finally, supervise the areas of separation as also the areas of limitation. Now, 30 kilometers on either side of this buffer zone, which is area of separation, there is area of limitation where only limited troops and equipment can be kept by either side. I dare say when I went there in August 2012, there was no threat of attack from Israel onto Syria because they were not maintaining those number of troops. They were in fact maintaining 1/3. The Syrians had also thinned out to tackle these armed opposition groups. So neither side was preparing for a war. Therefore, our mandate was being fulfilled. But we started facing a lot of problems of, restrictions of movement and also the lives of peacekeepers being endangered. When we talk about the principles, before we actually come to the principles, we have to look at the preamble of the United Nations, which says to save the future generations of mankind from the scourge of war. It also talks about human rights, the equality of men and women, as also the equality of small and bigger nations, respect for international law, and then promoting social progress, that is development, standards of living, and larger freedoms. Now, you have to see this in relation to the prevailing situation, which was a total hodgepodge, where people of all hue and cry with huge weapons were firing at each other, mainly opposition groups and the Syrian, and some overspill came onto the Israeli side, and the Israelis also protested. They also retaliated at times. So when it comes to consent per se, this particular mission, the mandate was every 6 months, both the parties, they pledged to it, and it was extended every 6 months, ever since 1974. But right now, the way we were having this situation where the opposition groups are almost next to the United Nations positions and operating from there, we were not very sure whether the present government at that point in time would last for long, or whether we were now juxtaposed to the future rulers of Syria. So the consent, nobody was sure whether when it comes to the next June or then December, whether the present Syrian government would give us the consent to continue or not. Therefore, one had to do the tightrope walk and had a balancing act in operating there and not taking any sides. Now, when it comes to impartiality, both the sides, the UN mission was a whipping boy for both the sides. The armed opposition groups and also some groups affiliated, some militia groups affiliated to the government troops, they had taken away a lot of vehicles of the UN, including some bulletproof vehicles. And they were using them with impunity. Therefore, every time a white vehicle was seen in the mission and some fire came from that side, the UN was being blamed by either side that we were trying to help the other side. The Syrian government even went to the extent of sending their MP vehicles, which are white in color. They send bulletproof vehicles with the troops inside, and it is just written MP outside. And all these groups who are there, they're not literate, they're not, they have not read English. That MP could be taken as UN also, and they were confused. So initially they held fire, and finally when the fire was coming onto them, they started fighting back. Now, we were accused by all the 30-odd groups that we were siding the government forces. And every time we had to explain, go to a length, take the risk of, talking to them in the field, where there's an AK gun on one side and there is an automatic weapon on the other, and trigger-happy young boys are sitting on them. And we're trying to tell them, look, you let us carry on our mandate. We are here to ensure that Israel and Syria do not go to war. Whatever atrocities are happening onto you by our government, those are also being reported in our daily reports to New York. So this impartiality was challenged because Syrian government, besides other things, accused us of giving ammunition, weapons, guidance, transportation, medical aid, and medicine to all the armed opposition groups who were there. In purely from humanitarian point of view, when injured people came to the post, and luckily for the first time when it happened, I was talking to my interlocutor in my headquarters. That was the last time he visited Camp Fuad. Thereafter, every time when I had to meet him, I had to go to Damascus after crossing 8 to 10 barriers, a distance which was covered in 45 minutes earlier, not to sometimes 3 to 4 hours from Camp Fuad to go to Damascus. Now, I told this gentleman, I said, look, there are some people who are wanting, they're injured, they're wanting medical aid. And he says, the entire Syria is burning, whom all will you give medical? I said, to those few who are close to us, and we are not going to make a distinction between a Syrian soldier or an opposition group or a civilian, innocent civilian, as long as they don't come without weapons. He very reluctantly agreed. That day, 22 people were treated on one of our posts, forward posts, and luckily 3 were Syrian army soldiers. One of them had already deserted actually to the Free Syrian Army. So it was bugger's murder. But it was well taken by the Syrian government, and at times when the Israelis helped, sometimes at our behest only, the opposition groups in giving them medical aid, that was also, we were accused by the Syrian government that you and the Israelis are, you're not impartial, you are trying to work against the interests of the Syrian government. We told them, no, we are only restricting ourselves to providing them first aid and then medical assistance in whichever way we can. Coming to the use of force, which is, been talked about and very correctly connected, whether to use force or not. Now, here we were not equipped to use force against any of the people. We could only use force to safeguard our own interests, our own lives, as also the UN property that we were entrusted with as per the mandate. And in that, initially I found that the troops, because of the legacy, were very reluctant to have an assertive position. And sometimes small, little, short sized Arabs stopped burly UN troops from Fiji and all and other countries. Just told them, show us your boot, what is there in the dicky? And the weapons were lying there rather than being on person, and they were taken away. So I said, all this must end, and we finally started having proper military convoys, movement was controlled, and we were into an assertive mode, which sailed us through for the next 1.5 years. It's only towards the end, as Ambassador Mukherjee had mentioned, that ISIS-affiliated groups started targeting us directly. And that is the time our restrictions of movement were further aggravated. We could not even take logistic support. We could not support our positions in the south logistically. And I told the Syrian interlocutor that if we can't do it, then I'll do it from the west, because otherwise Syria is the host nation. But our troops can't. I mean, they have reserves of 7 to 10 days, but eventually we have to go through. So my orders to all the positions were that any route which is locked to any position, I mean, for 48 hours, thereafter it will be opened with force. So first time I sent the CO Phil back to, there was an ID outside one of his posts in the south. And when they went closer, they were fired upon by the rebels. And today the CO was all geared up and he returned the fire. Suddenly the white flags came up to say, no, we are not enemies of the UN. We will allow the UN to move around. We said, but why are you putting IDs on the same routes that we are using? Please shift them to the interior. If you are, they were trying to make them in a defensive. The old, mines, anti-tank mines and all were rudely removed from 73 war, and mine necklaces were made, and improvisation was done with a lot of thought, and these were acting as improvised IEDs. So they did remove them, and that is the only way we had to get a little assertive in every which way to make sure that we continue to, stay there. Eventually, when they took 45 Fijians as hostages from one post, and they surrounded another 72 Filipinos. That time, there were two posts of Philippines, 68 and 69. And we got the information that finally they're strengthening their noose around the northern one, that is 68. And there's less number of rebels surrounding 69. That's the time I told the newly inducted Post Reserve Company from Ireland, I said, you go and get these 32 Filipinos out from position 69. They went in a very in a shocking manner to the rebels who were just there, but they did not react, and we were able to take out 32 people. So it is not the use of force. The point I want to make is, it is the threat of using force. If you're able to interpose between two opposing groups and avoid a clash, you won the day, as it was done in Sudan under General Jusbi leader. And projecting the force itself may, most of the time, avoid any violent actions. So I was told by General Birdie to take only 15 minutes. So here I've finished. And I just want to make a caveat, point about the caveats. There were 17 European nations together had caveats to say that our observers will not go there. They will not go to so-and-so position. And it became very difficult for the rest of the UNSO observers, because we get observers from UNSO, which is based in Jerusalem, for other countries to kind of, take their position. And therefore, when 5 out of the 6 troop contributing countries pulled out, I said any new TCCs coming will not have caveats. And UN headquarters ensured that there were no caveats in the UNDOF TCCs. Thank you very much for your patience, and we'll take on questions.
Thank you, General Singha, more so specifically for adhering to the timeline. He is from my same squad. I think he has been kind to me. No, this is from General Singha's talk. What my takeaway is that we have seen a different shades of interpretation of the 3 principles of peacekeeping. So one of the important points, unlike the interested conflict, you use force not to protect the civilians, but protect yourself, and maybe from preventing someone else from protecting the civilians. And he talked about Israel and Syria. it is a one side of the instability. Now we'll go to Lebanon to complete the circle of instability in the point of instability of the point of instability of the world in the Middle East. We'll request General Nehra to speak about Lebanon, but Israel and Lebanon. General Nehra, because he retired as the principal staff officer Army headquarters, he had a checkered career while in service, various important assignments, and of course, he is, I think, expert as a conflict management, internal intrastate conflict. And he took it with him when he went there as a deputy head of the deputy force commander of Lebanon. He was there before the war, during the war, and also after the war. If today UNIFIL can boast of contributing absence of war for close to 2 decades, I think because of the way he contributed to restructuring of UNIFIL in his time, and of course, the way that thinking of the UNIFIL to deal with this, emerging situations every day. And it was easy for me to, when I relieved him, to understand, but I could never fit in his shoes. His famous cliche is that Lebanon is something 5 minutes you could be in the beach, or next 5 minutes you could be in the bunker. And another special trait of General Nehra is that you give him 15 minutes, he finishes up 10 minutes. I could never defeat him in this. So I request General Nehra to enlighten us on this subject.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. You're placing a great burden on my shoulders. Can you hear me, please? Singer, if you can raise your hand, because... Oh, thank you. Thank you, General Sharma and Dr. Raghavan, for giving me this opportunity, and a privilege, I would say, to air my views and share some experiences with this august audience. Such luminaries present around, one feels little dwarfed there. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, a very good afternoon to you. And let's see if I can finish in 10 or 12. But when I was selected to join UNIFIL, my colleagues were complimenting me with a little bit of envy, saying, oh my God, you're going to a 5-star mission, Switzerland of the East and Beirut of the Middle East. When I went there, I really thought so. Till such time, one seasoned peacekeeper told me, General, don't be fooled. Here you can have a martini on the beach one moment, and the next moment you would be jumping in a bunker. What Tony just said. Little did I know that these words were quite prophetic, because just 5 months later, when I had met the commander ISF, Internal Security Force, that time the Lebanese army was not deployed in the south, the UNIFIL area. And the commander told me that they had just got a cabinet sanction or government sanction to deploy 1,000 more personnel in the south. UN headquarters was really elated, and I think they started toying with the idea of drawing the mission further down. UNIFIL was at its lowest strength that time, 2,000 peacekeepers, just 2 battalions and logistic elements. So 10th of July is my meeting with the Commander ISF. We were also really, really happy that finally we may be seeing lasting peace and Lebanon will take control of South on their own. 2 days later, precisely 2 days later, 12th of July, Hezbollah ambushed a mounted patrol, an APC patrol of Israeli Defense Forces. They destroyed one APC, and in the fracas that followed, I think Israel lost about 8 soldiers, and Hezbollah kidnapped 2. Now, this kidnapping was the one that bugged Israel, I think. Their reaction was very swift, very violent, and very strong. And what followed, I would not like to remember that period of 34 days. We had 45 posts all along the blue line, and during the next 34 days, the entire Lebanon bore the brunt of the might of Israeli Defense Forces, of Israeli army. They started with aerial bombardment, artillery bombardment, tank fire, and naval gun fire blockading of Israel for about 7 days, and then the infantry moved in, because Hezbollah kept firing rockets into Israel. To cut the long story short, it resulted in huge damages. South Lebanon was practically destroyed, razed to the ground, particularly the Shia villages. There were over 1,500 casualties on either side, mainly Lebanese, 1,200 of them, and more than 1 million civilians displaced. And that was the plight, and mainly Lebanese. Lebanese were displaced. And you talk of roads, you talk of petrol pumps, bridges, everything was damaged. Our posts were cut off. We ran out of fuel, we ran out of water, but our people hung on. They held on. Result, it cost the international community upwards of $15 billion, maybe close to 20, in war damages and whatever to rebuild Lebanon, and also on the Israeli side. Israel, I think, suffered something like 5 billion in losses. So this is the cost of war, and this is where I would like to say that what did UNIFIL do? A lot of people say, a lot of critics who said, well, what did you do? And like General Singha said, we were also accused by both sides of siding with the other. But UNIFIL held on to the positions, and that helped us rebuild the mission very quickly and expand. Protection of civilians, the one that has now come into the mandate of UNIFIL, now means at that time in Resolution 1701. Protection of civilians, we did it even though it was not our mandate. And a very unique mechanism was instituted, was put in place by, hats off to our force commander, General Alain Pellegrini, Frenchman. The civilians, when Israelis were bombing their cities, towns, and villages, many places they were trying to get into our posts, like what happened in Monuk. So, but then we were very, very firm in saying that we will not allow it, because a platoon post, and if there are 1,000 civilians wanting to come in and take shelter, they will neither have shelter, nor food, nor water, which we were in any case very short of. So what we devised was, we designated temporary UN positions by putting our APCs on 4 corners, let's say, of a football field, of a school compound, and herding the civilians there, escorting them there, and telling Israel that this is now a UN designated position. You will not target it. It worked. It worked, let me tell you this. And of course, rescue missions from debris, our engineers went and did a great job. So just one wonders, if UNIFIL had been stronger like it is today, would Hezbollah have carried out that raid? And would Israel have come to that retaliation? I remember one incident when we talk of use of force. UNIFIL is now authorized to use force in circumstances other than self-defense and protection of property. So one incident after UNIFIL had expanded, there was an incident on the Blue Line, wherein the Israelis, it was a violation, the Israeli tanks moved into Lebanon. And we quickly moved we had MBTs by then, the French MBT. So we had a QRF, we also moved our tanks, and it was a face-off between UNIFIL tanks and Israel tanks. And then, of course, diplomacy took over, and force commander was talking to the IDF commanders, and we were talking at some other levels. But I shudder to think, if even one round had been fired by either side, what would be the fate? But then UNIFIL did its part to at least show its resolve to use force to stop the aggressor. So that, I think, use of force, this is at a higher level, I would say. Tanks are not available in any other mission, I think, just about. This was one of the very few. We, at a lower level, when you talk of consent, at the strategic level, yes, there is consent. Lebanon and Israel both are member states of the UN. And when they sign an agreement and a resolution comes into force, both are giving their consent. And so is the organization like Hezbollah, non-state actor, but dominant influence in Lebanese politics. So tacit approval is there of Hezbollah also to the UN resolution. So at the strategic level, we have the consent, but at the tactical level, many occasions, this consent is diluted. When the peacekeeper UN patrol is hampered, not allowed to move, the freedom of movement is restricted. not allowed to go on a particular road, to a particular area, to a particular ravine. So that is where use of force, though authorized, but should the peacekeeper use it indiscriminately? And there are people, there were times when we were on the brink, actually, particularly like it was pointed out by General CP also, that different nationalities, and even Dr. Cedric, different nationalities apply the mandate in a different way, depending on their own experience and their own understanding. So some of the, I'll not name them, some of the contingents were always having a face-off with Hezbollah, whereas others did not have. So what we advise them, that take the Lebanese army with you and let the Lebanese army defuse the situation. Because the mandate also says, assist the Lebanese army in ensuring that there is no presence of hostile activity, etc., etc. So that is the place you have to be tactful. At the same time, show your resolve. Show your resolve. The other part, use of force, we have said, impartiality, absolutely essential. I think Chandra Prakash has dwelt upon it at length. You cannot be neutral. You have to be impartial, and you have to show it like that. So that is a sine qua non, actually, for peacekeeping. And frequently we will be accused. We were accused a number of times by both the Israelis and the Lebanese of siding with the other side. But then we stood our ground. I'll quote you an incident. After the war, there was a briefing on the Israeli side by the Israeli Northern Command, calling the ambassadors and defense attaches of all the troop contributing countries of UNIFIL, giving them their perception of war, how it developed, how it manifested, and what they were thinking about it. So I was also one of the invitees as the deputy force commander, and there, of course, Israelis gave their perception, their side of story. So after having listened to them, the whole thing, and when they said, let's move to lunch, I interrupted them and said, let me give you the correct perception. And I just gave them a 5 or 7 minutes brief rundown on how the conflict evolved and how it was perceived on the Lebanese side and how it was perceived by us. So I also made a mention that, yes, I understand that Israel IDF is professional army like we are, and we understand you have certain compulsions. But as a peacekeeper, as part of a UN peacekeeping force, I will not be partisan. I will not be partial. And believe you me, out of the 29 ambassadors, at least 15 of them approached me after that talk of asking me something more. Even an Israeli general said, General, oh, very good that you are here. And now you must bring your wife over and come for good touristic places in Israel. I just told him, General, I'm not here for tourism. I'm here to do a job, and we will do it. Okay, whether you like my opinion or not, that will be a fact. So I think impartiality, if you show, your respect amongst the parties will only grow. The moment you show neutrality, the respect will go down. Partiality, of course, it will. National caveats, very, very important. I'm so happy to learn General Singha said that he was able to get these national caveats away. I doubt if that is really implemented in most cases, because national caveat is always there. We saw it during the war. We saw it after the war. There were some contingents who just won't do a particular thing. Then also, as a peacekeeper, I think you have to see there were certain contingents who would act only after you give them a written order, an op order or a fragmentation order. They used to call it frago. Whereas we are used to moving or operating on verbal orders. We may be documenting it later, but there were certain contingents just refused to move. But that is their ethos. So I think we need to, that is again a national caveat, one would say. One incident I would just like to highlight. One of our patrol bases was hit directly by a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb from the Israeli side. patrol base Khiam, 4 observers from UNSO who were under our command. That whole building was destroyed, and of course there were casualties. In fact, there we could not even get their bodies in one piece. Can you believe it that even their own nationalities refused to remove the remains? Till the Indian battalion, and this is where Dr. Cedric's point comes in, that the Indian battalion, 4-6 to be precise, wonderful people, they took the risk, removed or brought the remains of the 4 peacekeepers, identified them, put them in body bags, and transported them towards the Israeli side for a decent burial. So this is the type of caveats that you will come across. Certain contingents said we cannot touch a dead body till our coroner comes. And many other cases, many other times, it was our medicos who were evacuating injured, in fact, even removing the bodies from burning buses, whereas others won't do. So those caveats will I think, remain. One ambassador called me, said, take my contingent away and take them to an area of safety. I said, Ambassador, tell me where in Lebanon. Where? Which place is out of range of Israel weapons or aircraft? So these caveats, I think, will remain, and the peacekeepers, as commanders, I think we have to work around it. Ultimately, I think, Tony, I will save you some time, because whatever I have left, General Bardalai can take on, because he relieved me there, and he's just giving me too much credit. He did an even better job, and he's a more educated guy today, doing PhD in UN peacekeeping and things like that. Congratulations, Tony, for your PhD. And finally, I would just like to say effectiveness of a peacekeeping mission. Traditional missions, I think these will continue because of the international power play. The Arab world, I think, has yet to come to terms to the existence of Israel. The moment you remove the international presence, whether UNSO, UNDOF, or UNIFIL, there is an existential threat to Israel. And this audience knows what are the implications. Therefore, I think these 3 missions are likely to continue, and their contribution cannot be ignored. Only thing is, what mandate you give, resources must be given. Ultimately, effectiveness of a mission will depend on the larger political context and also efforts of all stakeholders. Hezbollah is a stakeholder, but Hezbollah is not in control. For them, Israel is their sworn enemy. But then, for the Lebanese people, they are Robin Hood. And today, if ISIS has not got an inroad into Lebanon from the Syrian side, Hezbollah has a large role to play. They are fighting ISIS. I think Jan Singha will agree with me. They are fighting along with the Syrian forces there. And they have backing of Iran and Syria. So the Lebanese people really love them. And their post-war, I saw their people, Hezbollah people, helping out in rebuilding Lebanon. Individuals. And just a few recommendations, sir. General Nambiar, sir, would you agree that peacekeepers are not geared for peace building? So there should be a special mechanism for that, neither to deal with terrorism. I think whether structural reforms of Security Council come about or not, a smaller recommendation I would like to give. I had gone to Jakarta, Indonesia, at their invitation in a UN seminar. I saw the infrastructure and the peacekeeping establishment of Indonesia. State of the art. Huge. I think credit to that goes to their president, Yudhoyono, who was there from 4 to 14, who had served as a peacekeeper in UNPROFOR as head of the Indonesian team. So he realized the importance of peacekeeping. So we have far greater know-how, wherewithal, and expertise. We should, I think, have a much larger center for UN peacekeeping, and in some place close to Delhi. I think we should be working very hard towards that and use it as a soft power in world politics. This is my recommendation. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a great privilege talking to you.
Thank you, General Naga, sir, for being kind. I could feel your emotion flowing out of your deliberations. Now, gentlemen, we have seen two peace operation traditional, that is, Singh has spoken about UNDOF, and General Nehra deliberated upon uniqueness of UNIFIL. Both are totally different from the complex so-called intrastate conflicts which bring a lot of us into the limelight. A basic difference I would like to highlight, my understanding is that, if the conflict goes, if your situation go out of your control of the peacekeepers in case of intrastate conflict like South Sudan and Congo, for instance, the conflict, I think conflict will be limited within the geographical limit of the two countries or maximum regional. But it is not the case in case of UNDOF and UNIFIL, because the amount of the powers plays going on in the air, Western nation involved, because whether it is Israel get into conflict, full-fledged with Syria or Lebanon, more countries of the Middle East will get involved. When they get involved, the superpowers are bound to get involved. So it is one of the reasons why I said that even if not much is known about these two traditional missions, they're all interconnected to it. You cannot say we'll continue with the UNIFIL and we can close down UNDOF. Or you cannot say either way that we continue with the UNDOF, we'll close down UNIFIL. Because, and question came what General Nehra said, many people ask, what have UNDOF and UNIFIL has done? I would say that the contribution is more than anything else a negative peace. That the negative peace, the cessation of violence, a major conflict for almost close to 2 decades, the first step towards a positive peace. I don't look at that anytime soon the positive peace will come because of this geopolitical compulsions. But the negative peace is one of the big contributions, but what the traditional peace operation has made. Now, after having said that, we are running behind time. And so that is a bad thing. The good point is that I do not see any questions in the chat box. Nonetheless, I think I must give 5 minutes. Should any question come up, you can shoot this question, but directly address to the speaker without any comments, elaboration in the context what they have said. Otherwise, I think anyone who wants to post questions, they can be one-to-one with the speakers through the email ID or telephone call. Not that I'm discouraging anyone, because after some time people will call off. That is the reason. Okay, fine then. Gentlemen, if there is no questions, next is that the takeaway by General Asthana. But before that, I will take exactly 5 minutes to give some of the points. I will not repeat what the speakers have said. When Dag Hammarskjöld identified the principle of peacekeeping after deployment of UNEF in 1958, it was more in the context of interstate conflict. And even the non-P5 members also could help return of peace, and use of force was expected to be on the rarest occasion. However, with the number of parties increasing day by day in intrastate conflict and violence becoming more intense, the current alignment of the peacekeeping operations seems to have changed the very definition of the peacekeeping principles. Consent is no more absolute, and availability of the consent at the strategic, operational, and tactical level is rare. The consent is not only by the parties to the conflict. Now, it is mostly conditional. Now, despite the comprehensive agreement, consent seems to be elusive. Like, the consent is conditional is not a new trend. It was there earlier, only thing is it has become more obvious now. Now, when it is available, it is generally out of motive, some motive, something like in Rwanda, in spite of the Arusha agreement, peace agreement was signed, that after the peacekeepers got deployed, there's an emergence of the Hutu Power Center, which actually took place before this 6 April 1994, the genocide took place. Or, for instance, Muhammad Aidid in Somalia 1993, when he agreed initially for deployment of 500 peacekeepers for the escort of the humanitarian convoy until Buttress Ghali went to Security Council without informing Muhammad Aidid, recommended for 3,000 peacekeepers. Muhammad eyed it, took it as a breach of faith, and he withdrew his consent. Similarly, for instance, Hezbollah gave its approval in UNIFIL for SCR 1701 in return of not naming Hezbollah in the Security Council resolution. Now, in case of UNMIS, after this UNMIS, the South Sudan became independent. The fight, the turf war between the two rival faction was predictable. In spite of that, both the parties agreeing for the deployment of peacekeeping is still the intriguing part. As the principle of the peacekeeping of the consent is on the fence and ready to be recanted at the slightest pretext. Now, when that happens, it will be followed by first that obstructions to the freedom of movement, or I would say obstruction of the peacekeepers for implementing the mandate, increasing hostility, and of course, then finally attack on peacekeepers. Now, impartiality has replaced neutrality. When non-P5 members were no longer able to rein in the number of troops when the conflict became more complex and violence became more intense. But the difference between the definition of the neutrality and impartiality still remain confusing, either out of ignorance or maybe intentional on part of the troop contributing countries because of the national interests. There were instances when peacekeepers refused to use force even on their own self-defense, even under Chapter 6. There are also instances when peacekeepers did not abdicate their responsibility when it came to saving innocent human lives. For instance, that when, like Cedric brought out, on 16 July 2016, when the SPLA, the South Sudanese government army, stormed Terrain Hotel in broad daylight, beaten up the foreign workers, raped foreign females, and abused them. And the same people kept crying for help, and peacekeepers did not respond for a number of hours. I think that is the point of time UNMISS lost its credibility and legitimacy and impartiality. General Chandra Prakash brought out about Force FIB, the Force Intervention Brigade in MONUSCO. It is also a case that MONUSCO, I look at it as MONUSCO losing impartiality and legitimacy. It was created in the wake of M23 rebels taking over town of Goma in 2012. It defeated M23 rebels, but it targeted only 66 out of 70 armed groups. When FIB that represent MONUSCO and operates along with FARDC in support of the Congolese government, which is known for the 65% of the HR violence in the Congo, the credibility and legitimacy of the UN is lost. Even in traditional peace operations like UNIFIL, which is deployed in Lebanon, not between Israel and Lebanon, it is a matter of perception. Forever, Israel keep complaining that UNIFIL is partial to Lebanon because they are deployed there, they do not see, they do not report. And inside Lebanon, a lot of the South Lebanese populations, basically Hezbollah support base, they look at many peacekeeping contingents, mostly for the Western nations, with suspicion. They alleged that these are the countries' past intelligence across the border to the Israeli side. The same Israel, when it comes to UNDOF, they said that the redeployment which had taken place of UNDOF when the ISIS came to Syria should go back to original deployment, because they feel the UNDOF is to look at only at Israel, not at this. Look at the double standard. In case now the center of gravity in the traditional or non-traditional peace operations remains with the civilian population. In case of traditional peace operations like Lebanon and the UNIFIL, what happened? Any attempt to do anything that is against the interest of the Hezbollah, allowed to say the civilian populations, that you will be crossing the red line. And when you cross that red line, the local population is withdraw its support, then government of Lebanon also withdraw its consent. In case of UNDOF, I told you that current deployment is not being seen by Israelis. Now, because of that is now impartiality to an extent is a matter of perception, which is formed by the history of the peacekeepers, with the contingents of the TCCs. For example, in case of Rwanda, when Belgium's impartial status was doubted from the day they landed in Rwanda in November 1993, when the 450 Belgian peacekeepers came from Somalia, which was operating under Distinct Chapter 7. They were arrogant in their behavior. They were rude, and they were just, and these Hutus were just waiting for a chance to retaliate against. And you know what had happened is they were the first victim. The 10 Belgian peacekeepers were cut into pieces, along with the Prime Minister of Rwanda there, on the 6th of April, I think. Similarly, in Lebanon, like I said, a matter of perception. The way the civilian populations, Hezbollah, or even the government of Lebanon look at the peacekeepers, or rather Israelis look at from the other side, the peacekeepers from the Western nation, or peacekeepers from India, or for that matter, peacekeepers from Southeast Asia region, is totally different. Now, use of force is by far the most controversial of the three principles. It is allowed in self-defense in Chapter 6, but those who do not want to use force, even under Chapter 7, they will not use it. Like General Nambiar brought out, there is a need for calibration to use the force in the context of the existing geopolitical environment. This has been brought out by Ambassador Mukherjee, Dr. Cedric, General Chandra Prakash, General Singha, and also General Nehra. Now, on the other hand, there are examples of peacekeepers that using force and they too conduct moral responsibility, no matter how the mandate is worded. Therefore, if the peacekeeping principle is not absolute, and if these are thought to be as a continue to be cloud our mind, the question is therefore, how does one implement the mandate? Now, in all reference to performance of peacekeeping operations, mandates become the first casualty. It is acceptable or logical to say that a stronger mandate supported by adequate resources and capable troops help the peacekeepers to implement the mandate. However, if those who are entrusted with the responsibility to implement mandate not willing to implement the mandate for one reason or the others, then the peacekeeping missions bound to fail. Given the tradition of pen-holder system of formulating mandate at the UN headquarters is not likely to go away very soon, mandate will continue to be product of a political compromise and adjustment amongst the P5 members. Now, wording of the mandate can be stronger. We have seen the most of the contemporary peacekeeping operations, the very strong mandate is there. Mandate will say what is to be done, but mandate will not mention how it is to be done, what is to be done. Mandate will not state the red line which are not to be crossed, because if the red lines are crossed, the sanctity of the mission will actually come into question. Maybe mission will be jeopardized. The people will, the host nations will do the consent, and before time, I think mission has to be closed. How to therefore implement the mandate when adherence to principle peacekeeping is difficult? I believe that the answer to these lies in the two questions. First, understanding, accepting the challenge of the peacekeeping principles, the different colors and shades, that you cannot have same standard and same answer for each and every peacekeeping operation. You have to evolve over a period of time. The second answer to the question will be that why the peacekeepers are required, what they are expected to do. If the peacekeepers are primary responsibility to save the human beings, innocent human beings, like General Singha already had mentioned, then, and also the protection of the civilian population has become the core objective of the all peace operation, whether interested or or interstate peacekeeping, traditional or non-traditional peacekeeping operation, then what remains for the commanders on ground to formulate their own mission objective, no matter what is worded and how the mandate is worded in the Security Council resolution. Now, at this point, gentlemen, I cannot think of any other better example than one Nordbet commander. General Nambiar may be knowing about him. He was a commanding officer of a unit comprised of a lot of reservists. When he was deployed in 1993, November, in Srebrenica, he asked for what is the mandate. When he did not get clear-cut answer, he set his own mission objective and he had given orders to his platoon commanders. As long as you take any action to save human lives, you can do anything, you can disobey all orders. He came under a lot of military and political pressure. He did not budge. Most of the time, he had switched off his radio sets. One of the distinct what had happened, one of his platoon located in a church, when it relieved the Canadian contingents on platoon, it was surrounded by Croatian contingents for 24 hours because there were 2 nurses, Muslim nurses. They were told that hand over them. He refused. He asked his commanding officer, what do I do? He said, you know my orders, what is to be done. The bombarded happened, both indirect and direct fire. He held on to his post for more than 24 hours. Finally, Croatian contingent decided to retreat. This is one kind of mission objective. Now, to be able to set this kind of mission objective and to entrust responsibility, which is entrusted on us, to discharge the responsibility entrusted on us, I think it will take years of grooming on profession, integrity, and honesty. Now, with this much, I hand over the set to General Asthana for the takeaways. General Asthana, I hope, even though I have given you, told you that I'll give you 15 minutes, I'm sure you are like General Nehra, you will be able to wrap it up by within 5 to 6 minutes so that Dr. Raghavan can deliver his closing address on time. Thank you.
I won't waste time on the formalities. Pleasure to learn from brilliant minds on peacekeeping and first-hand practitioners. Along with giving out the points, I would like to also give out the existing trend as to what is happening in United Nations as of today. Now, from one of the challenges which was not brought out is a financial challenge. And everything, peacekeeping is a major financial budget and everything flows down from there. To ward off that financial challenge, from 2015 onwards, 24% reduction has been there in the peacekeeping personals. And 23% reduction has been there in spending. So this has implications down the line at the mission level. And those implications sometimes become quite obvious. When it comes to the longevity of the mission, somebody brought out that yes, our permanent mission had spoken in UNSC a few days back. 4 missions have been closed from 2014 or 15 onwards. And Congo is being downsized. In addition to that, no multi-tasking mission is going to be there hereafter. The trend is to move from peacekeeping to peace operations and to peace building. Trend is to move from prevention, from the peacekeeping part to the prevention part. And you can see what is happening. The Department of Peacekeeping Operation is now Department of Peace Operations. The Political Affairs Department, that is Department of Political Affairs, is now merged with Department of Political Affairs and Peace Building Affairs. So this is DPPA now. Similarly, you find that the protection of civilians will continue to be, because the fact that bulk of the missions are stabilization missions. So therefore, whether you debate whether it should be there, should not be there, is immaterial. The protection of civilians is important. In Bhota panel, it was brought out very clearly that you cannot hide behind the shelter to say non-use of force for self-defense only, or etc., etc. Because if there is a humanitarian angle to it, and the humanitarian angle and sovereignty angle, they are sometimes work cross-purpose. And therefore, one of the major challenges which was brought out in by the Under Secretary General in UN Peacekeeping a few days back when I was attending a conference was that certainly a balance between the people-centric and the state-centric approach will have to be adopted. You cannot be one-sided, and that goes by the example of South Sudan as well. Another challenge, COVID-19 came up. It's a threat as well as a opportunity. Why it is a threat? Because obviously it made peacekeeping difficult. Why it is an opportunity? Because it did show peacekeepers in very good light in all the missions, because they had the presence and footprints all over. They could even certain small gestures like distribution of masks, they put them in a very good light. Then you have the interstate to intrastate focus. And this, even in the missions which were earlier interstate, like two of them which were discussed there, the intrastate content cannot be ruled out. They are very much there. Now coming on to an issue which was very well brought out, a number of questions came up on that, is on the mandate formulation and what happens in the DPK, in the UNSC. Now in UNSC, there is a statement to say, there is no doubt about it, that there is hardly any conflict in which the P5 do not have footprints directly or indirectly. We also know with the kind of P5 we have today, there are two groups. One is the Western group and other is the other group. Everyone understands what I'm talking about. So therefore, what is happening is, when you are drafting the mandate, the resolution gets divided. I had asked a specific question to the staff who is drafting the mandate. There are two problems which they brought out. Problem number one, that when we are drafting the mandate, we do not have the full picture. So we somehow draft a mandate, and a clause has been brought out that there will be a two-stage mandating process. Now, then this two-stage mandating process, the first one will be a draft resolution, and subsequently when the TCC are consulted and when they give the inputs, then you finalize it, the staff finalizes it. And at times there have been compromises made in drafting the mandate because some of the P5s don't agree with each other. So that's one issue. Too many actors in there are regional players, there are global players, and there are other actors which are also in the conflict zone. So they also make it slightly difficult now when it comes to the peacekeeping is concerned. Now coming on to some of the issues. One is, if we actually want to protect the civilians and protect the female folk and the children folk, we need to increase the women representation, and for that I think a lot is being done. Even in India we would have seen the problem is only in the contingents, because in contingents what happens is the percentage is slightly limited, and therefore now I think a certain hybrid contingents are being sent. We are sending police women and we have also started recruiting the military people as well. When it comes to protection of civilians, capacity building brought out very well. I think I need no explanation. These protection of civilian missions are under media glare. So we have to be careful. The human rights and media are important, and therefore robust mandate is important. The counter-insurgency operations, certainly there are many who believe, and rightly so, including the United States, I heard them as well, that the counter-terror operation is not the mandate of the peacekeeping. But the problem is that the peacekeepers do get willy-nilly involved, because when a threat comes to the peacekeepers themselves and to the civil population, then everybody looks at the blue beret and expects the blue beret to do something. And you cannot hide behind the mandate at that stage. So therefore, it has become a reality. Unfortunately, in the UN Charter is absolutely silent on the use of force. I'm sorry, I'm hurrying up because of the shortage of time. Now, the next problem which the people at the grassroots level are complaining is that, yes, there is a requirement to deal with the non-state actors. And while dealing with the non-state actors, we are short of intelligence. There is no doubt about it. It was brought out by the practitioners as well. Now, I think there is a need that UN has to decide. As far as the neutrality is, there is a legal complication to it. There is a, I would say, there are ethical complications to it. There is a neutrality issue, and there is an issue of privacy of the host country as well. But the fact is, the technological empowerment has taken place. We can go into something called as the joint intelligence operating environment. Now we have to actually work out as to what is the operating environment in which I am working, in which I have to do the mission planning. So there is a system called as, I will not elaborate on that, there's a system called as mission planning process, and there is also a system wherein we call it intelligence operating environment. I think we will have to perhaps involve the GIS and all other kinds of instruments which are available today. There is another issue of the cyber warfare. There are 2 resolutions which have been passed. There is a group of governmental experts which is supposed to table the report in 2021. This is also an important issue which needs to be, I think, which was also needs to be discussed. As far as the jobs are concerned, and as far as various issues of the missions are concerned, I would say that there are multifarious tasks which the peacekeepers get involved with unknowingly, and even if they don't want to get involved, but they have earned a good name in that. Like in Lebanon, what has happened is when this disaster took place, I think peacekeepers did a fantastic job. Similarly, as far as the COVID is concerned, peacekeepers did a fantastic job. And there is also a concept of the hybrid battalions. Now, this is happening in Lebanon. That is, we have a battalion minus a company, and there is a Kazakh company involved. Similarly, there is a tendency to have the regional players, but then the regional players have got a little problem in a manner that the regional political dynamics that also takes place. So these are some of the issues which came up, and there are a lot more to it which I wanted to cover, but I think time is running out. So I will go back and hand over back to General Bardulai, keeping my promise.
General Asthana, thank you so much for the major takeaways you have given. And because I was running behind time and ex-Sub General Goswami was on my head, I forgot to introduce General Asthana. This is one. There's an excuse. The second is that actually, second excuse, General Asthana, everybody knows. We have been colleagues together, attended courses together, but I would say that if I had 1/4 of his perseverance and hard working and intelligence, maybe I would have been a slightly different person. So, and I will request one more thing, General Asthana, that when you give in writing your takeaways, I'm sure you would have elaborated. If you can elaborate on your takeaways on the main theme of the subject, then the principles and peacekeeping and this thing. Apart from this, these are very relevant points, but I hope you will be elaborate on that also. Having said that, I will now hand over the floor to Dr. Raghavan, Director of ICWA. Dr. Raghavan is Indian Foreign Service officer. He retired from the Pakistan as an Indian High Commissioner. Before that, he served in the Kuwait, United Kingdom. I didn't know that he served in Bhutan. And he has been part of this interest in, I would say, the current of historical research. And more importantly, anything is that I want to thank him for joining hand with USI of India, because USI India has already thanked you, but I am thanking you because I was a part of USI as a research fellow, and I'm slightly more emotionally attached to them. So anything that happens to peacekeeping, whether to USI, whether with the help of external help or something like that, this is my sincere gratitude to you, and I thank you so much. And I now request you to deliver your the closing address.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Major General B.K. Sharma, Director USI, General B.K. Goswami, other colleagues in the USI, Major General Bardulai. May I at the outset say how very delighted I am on behalf of the ICWA that this planned series of discussions on peacekeeping has begun with such an excellent and thought-provoking start. And for that, General Sharma, may I congratulate you and your colleagues and General Bardulai for the very creative way in which you have designed this webinar. And as I said, it sets a very high standard for all of us for the future discussions to follow. I found this organization of this webinar very, very interesting, with the excellent beginning provided by General Nambiar, by Ambassador Mukherjee and Dr. D. Conning. That larger overview was very, very thought-provoking and really set the stage for the subsequent interventions by Lieutenant General Chandra Prakash, Lieutenant General Singha, Lieutenant General Mehra, and finally the wrapping up by Major General Asthana. The mix of individual experiences and reflections on those experiences within the larger challenges of UN peacekeeping is really a very, very good insight into the challenges which confront UN peacekeeping today. And we heard a whole range of the issues that are involved, beginning with the distinction. It's not a watertight distinction, but nevertheless, for analytical purposes, that distinction is very important between traditional peacekeeping operations and the non-traditional ones. But as I said, this distinction on the ground often does not exist. And I think General Mehra had spoken about, while there may be a strategic consensus which underpins a particular traditional peacekeeping operation, nevertheless, on the ground, that strategic consensus does not prevent numerous other frictions and tensions from playing a larger-than-life role. Personally, I found the location of professional soldiers in a diplomatic environment something very interesting. One question which has always interested me is the divergence between the diplomatic way of thinking and the way a trained military mind thinks, because diplomats are trained to understand intentions, gauge interests, while the military mind is trained to evaluate capacities. This distinction, of course, is well known, but when a professional soldier is placed in a diplomatic context, it throws up a very, very rich array of reflections and impressions. And I think in the context of UN peacekeeping and the challenges it faces, today's discussion was very, very enriching. And I must say that it sets the stage very well for the subsequent events that will follow. Certain very thought-provoking issues were raised by General Nambiar and Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee in the beginning. First of all, what about terrorism, counterterrorism in the context of UN peacekeeping? And they had I saw in the chat box some very interesting remarks, and possibly this is something which we can reflect upon in subsequent sessions. Secondly, this dynamic or this unanswered chasm of peacekeeping versus peace building. Again, there's a very, very rich and insightful, acute observations were there by all the panelists. But this is something which we have to keep in mind and possibly explore further. Most of all, I would like to thank USI and Major General B.K. Sharma for having worked with us in first visualizing and then fleshing out this series of webinars. And I look forward to the subsequent discussions that will follow. Thank you very much.